All right, so today's video is going to be on dynamic rep ranges and why they're important when it comes to programming for hypertrophy. And this is something that's incredibly overlooked, and there's a reason for that. And the reason why people overlook this stuff is because rep ranges actually don't matter as much as we think they do. Personal preference definitely plays a role, and there's definitely certain lifts that can have better results and do have better results from working in a particular rep range. So between that and between personal preference, they have some degree of importance, but in the bigger picture, the rep range that you work in actually isn't quite as important as we think. And that ultimately leads to another issue within our programming, is that we overlook them because we don't think they're that important. But when it comes to programming, understanding how rep ranges work and why dynamic rep ranges are, I would almost say they're necessary for your best results in hypertrophy training. This is something that we need to truly understand to be able to train and program properly when it comes to hypertrophy training. And understanding variables that aren't important is actually important because they still play a role in programming. Just because they don't matter as much as something else doesn't mean you don't need to understand it. So my goal in this video is to give you an understanding of why this stuff actually matters. So dynamic rep ranges. This refers to rep ranges that can fluctuate based on your progress and your day-to-day performance, whether that's an increase or a decrease for whatever reason in your performance in your training. There are multiple different methods that utilize dynamic rep ranges. So dynamic rep ranges aren't necessarily a method in their own way, but you can apply them to other methods and you can apply them to your programming to make them work for you within your training program. So the biggest key with dynamic rep ranges is the ability to fluctuate and adapt based on more important variables in your training. So they don't, the rep range you work in isn't a core fundamental of hypertrophy training. As long as you're within a certain range of intensity or a certain range of reps total per set, it doesn't matter that much. What we need to do is use them properly to be the supporting role to more important variables, which is what rep ranges are. And that's why we need to understand that dynamic rep ranges are going to be better than static rep ranges in most cases for hypertrophy training. So this video is about rep ranges, but in reality, rep ranges aren't as important as we make them out to be. The important part is the freedom that dynamic rep ranges provide that make them work. Rep ranges are important, but they aren't as important as other variables in your training, like proximity to failure and volume. Dynamic rep ranges allow your proximity to failure, which by the way dictates your volume quality and potentially, therefore, your total volume, to be prioritized, while the rep ranges adapt to suit the needs of your proximity to failure. If you're doing this correctly, the reps you achieve each set in total will be slowly going up over time. So we need to understand the importance of the fundamentals and the variables in your training. What happens when you have a static rep range is now the top priority within that session and the top priority within your program is to meet a pretty arbitrary number. I think we can both agree that as long as you're within that, say, 6 to 20 rep range, it doesn't matter that much outside of minor personal preference or minor exercise preference rep ranges. So let's say on deadlifts, doing a set of 20, probably not the best, but still probably going to give you some muscle. So once you have an understanding that rep ranges are not as important as something like volume or proximity to failure, that allows us to program them properly. So what your program should be revolved around is, say, for this example, let's say proximity to failure. That's going to be a key driver of hypertrophy that we all probably should know by now. What happens when you have a static rep range is your proximity to failure adapts to meet that specific rep range. So take the 5x5 for example. If you're sticking with, say, 200 pounds on bench for a 5x5, you probably could have got maybe 8 reps for the first set if you're picking a weight that allows you to get 5 reps on that final set. So what this would typically look like is 3 reps in reserve on the first set, maybe 3 reps in reserve on the second, maybe 2 on the third and fourth set, and maybe 0 to 1 reps in reserve on that fifth set. Now we're seeing a fluctuation in our proximity to failure versus a fluctuation in our pretty arbitrary rep range. This should be reversed based on importance of these variables. Nobody thinks that the rep range that you work in and the rep that you hit each set is more important than your proximity to failure. We need to prioritize proximity to failure, and that should be our main driver. That should be the thing that we're focusing on, and the reps that we work with should be dynamic and adaptable to adapt to what the proximity to failure that we're shooting for is. Say on bench, you're going for one rep in reserve on each set. If you're hitting that, like your max reps on the first set is going to be 8, you should be doing 7 reps, and then you should be doing 7 reps again, then maybe 6, then 4 or 5 on that last set. And now we've gotten close enough to failure each set to drive muscle growth, and we're still within that rep range that we're kind of shooting for, about 4 to 7 or 4 to 8. And that's key. We don't need to worry about hitting 5. We need to worry about the proximity to failure. That's going to be most important. So having the reps adapt and adjust to your proximity to failure is going to be key. And like I said earlier, I'm not going to spend all this video going over this part, but your volume can fluctuate. The quality of your volume fluctuates based on your proximity to failure. If you're 4, 5, or 6 reps shy of failure, you're probably not getting much out of that set, especially on, I guess, more like isolation type lifts. You have to work with a consistent, good proximity to failure that you know works for you. The next part I want to talk about here is going to be one of my core fundamentals of this channel that I talked about. I want to say it was like my second or third video, so we're going to go right back to this one. So real versus artificial progressive overload. Progressive overload can only happen as fast as your muscle growth. Think about that one for a second. Progressive overload can only happen as fast as your muscle growth. Now that we know this, your training needs to be optimized. No, I read that wrong. Now that we know this, your training needs to optimize muscle growth, not a faster rate of progression. Our fastest rate of true progressive overload will be shown through muscle growth. Changing technique can lead to faster, quote unquote, progression, but this is artificial progress. Even though it's faster, it's building you less muscle. So if you're looking to build muscle, you're not going to be progressing as fast as you possibly can. That's just as bad, or maybe not quite, but it's bad, just like not progressing at all is too. So it almost looks like this. It's like a pyramid. So I guess more like a bell curve. So you have not progressing, and then a moderate progression that matches your muscle growth, and then on the other side of the bell curve, which is also not as good, it's going to be progression that's a little bit too fast, because that's going to come at the expense of other hypertrophy fundamentals, because it's possible to speed up progression, but that is always going to be at the expense of other variables, and it's not sustainable forever. You can slowly optimize technique, change your form, change your tempo, your setup, your stance, your grip width, bar positioning, all this kind of stuff. You can change that to slowly progress faster, but it's not real progression, just because the numbers, like your tonnage might be going up, your reps, your weight might be going up, but that's not the best way to train for muscle growth. So I know there's a tangent, but let me get back on track here. So let's see, where was I? So even though it might be faster, it's not going to be building you more muscle. So what you need to do is optimize your training to build muscle. You need to focus on hypertrophy fundamentals that I talk about on the channel. The next part that I want to talk about, to go back to static rep ranges, they have the wrong incentives. So you aren't as attached to the weight on the bar. You can shift your focus to consistent execution without worrying about numbers or chasing strength. You add weight out of necessity, not out of desire, and this is when you're working with dynamic rep ranges. With static rep ranges, your tonnage/volume jumps every time you add weight, and it feels like more of a PR, which becomes psychologically addicting. With a dynamic rep range, every time you add weight, you do so at the expense of reps, so it's not a PR, it's more of a trade. So instead of working with the same weight and the same reps for 2 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, whatever it ends up being, depending on your training age and the lift you're doing, what happens is all of a sudden you hit this magical PR when you can finally add weight to the bar. We start to get psychologically addicted. And this doesn't happen to everyone. And there are certain cases where this can actually be a good thing to incentivize you to train harder to hit a PR. I don't think that's the best for hypertrophy in my own philosophy for most people. But instead of having these PRs that you get addicted to chasing, what happens is you see a slow and steady progression, And you do that basically every session. And obviously there's going to be down weeks, there's going to be down days where some variable prevents you from going up, where you might actually lose a couple reps, and that's totally normal as long as in the bigger picture you're going higher up. But you never hit that magical PR. And a lot of people would get upset about that, but I actually view that as a good thing because it's not something that we're chasing. It just happens automatically from training properly for hypertrophy and actually building muscle in the first place. And when you do add weight, it's not this big magical PR you've been waiting for. You add weight at the expense of reps. So it's an even trade-off. It's just a consistent, slow progression that works best for hypertrophy. Your progression, you want it to match your rate of muscle growth, and you want to keep your volume and proximity to failure consistent, as I've said throughout this video. So to continue on these kind of bad incentives of static rep ranges, with static rep ranges, there's incentives to change your technique. And to get even more specific there, if you're trying to add weight, like you can add weight. Even if you're training properly for hypertrophy, you can always add weight because your tempo is going to be a little bit slower. And you won't really notice if you just speed up your tempo a little bit. So something like an increase in tempo, which isn't as beneficial for hypertrophy, a change in range of motion, so less depth, not quite getting a full contraction on certain lifts, changing your range of motion, changing your grip or your stance or the bar placement on certain lifts, this can change your range of motion as well. And these are ways that you trick yourself into thinking that you're progressing, but in reality, the workouts you're doing and the sets you're doing are just less stimulative. So we end up chasing that super fast progression that actually it looks like we're increasing, but in reality, they're less stimulative, so they're actually less optimal for hypertrophy. So it's it's another bad incentive. So you'll notice that all of these variables are more important than the reps you get per set, and it makes no sense to sacrifice these variables to meet a static rep range. To best train for hypertrophy, your rep ranges need to be dynamic and adaptable to suit the requirements of your more foundational variables. You take something like a 5x5 again. Let's say the most reps you can hit on set 1 is 5. Maybe set 2 you can get 5 again. Even set 3, say you get 4 or 5. When you get to those 3, 4, and 5 sets, there's an incentive now to lose those hypertrophy fundamentals. There's an incentive to change your technique, your range of motion, to bounce the bar off your chest on a bench, to try and get that arbitrary number of reps. So what we need to do is allow a little bit of attrition from set to set. That's normal and that's fine. And that allows us to keep the good technique, the consistent technique, the consistent proximity to failure, the quality of volume that we're getting in. It allows that to stay consistent, and we're not molding our other variables to meet something that doesn't matter quite as much as the fundamentals, like your proximity to failure, volume, and technique. The last point that I want to touch on, this is just another benefit of dynamic rep ranges, is that it's an automatic manipulation of intensity, because when you meet, let's say you're using the rep goal system, when you meet your rep goal, you make that trade. So you get rid of a bunch of reps in order to add weight. And that's what you should do, because at a certain point, going higher and higher in reps is less beneficial. Like if you're doing 15, 20 plus reps every single set, at a certain point, that's just a lot of fatigue and time wasted, and you're less likely to fail certain lifts due to muscular failure or technical failure that we're actually shooting for. So when it comes to an automatic manipulation of intensity, there's a potential benefit in a novel stimulus if there's any value to that. I'm not a huge believer in needing novelty to drive muscle growth, but if there is a benefit to that, then cool. If not, no worries. Doesn't hurt you. It also ensures that you get a variety of rep ranges with each lift over time. This way, you can pick a rep range that works best for you for each lift and reap the benefits of both. As you adapt, the reps will get higher and the weight you're working with becomes a lower percentage of your 1 rep max. This helps avoid nagging pains and injuries by ensuring you don't stay in a low rep range for long if you choose to work with lower reps to start. Of course, you can program around this without dynamic rep ranges, but why try to guess your performance when your training predicts it for you? So that's what I want to leave the video at today. I hope you guys learned a little bit, and I hope you think about reps, and I hope you think about programming them and how to use dynamic rep ranges in your training. I do want to make a video on methods that you can use dynamic rep ranges with, but that's going to be it for today. Stay tuned for the next one.